I was fairly new to working out on the missile sites. Right above us was a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead. It was a monster waiting to go off. You think about working on a weapon of mass destruction, you're counting on everything to work perfect all the time. And things just don't work perfect all the time.
From the very beginning of the atomic age, there has been a sense of this immense power just being on the verge of slipping out of our control.
The warhead on top of the Titan II was 3 times as powerful as all the bombs used in the Second World War, including both the atomic bombs.
Sheriff, has the Air Force told you very much?
They haven't told me a darn thing.
Does that make you mad?
Yes, it does.
We got a potential nuclear explosion 46 miles from here. If that warhead explodes, Little Rock's gone. Do we let the world know? What do you do?
This is your warning.
Help me!
For me.
The governor of the state of Arkansas is Bill Clinton.
As regards a nuclear explosion, all we can do is to trust the experts.
Is there a warhead on the site?
I cannot confirm or deny.
The Air Force is telling people it's not happening.
Before September 18th,
This is just an nightmare.
the only warheads that we thought would go off in the United States would be Soviet. We never considered our own warheads could detonate on our own continent.
Nuclear weapons are machines, and every machine ever invented
This is
eventually goes wrong.
Guys, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. The film is chilling, to say the least. It's something that I think Americans haven't considered in quite a while. The idea of a nuclear threat is usually North Korea. We don't even think of the Russians as a nuclear threat at this point anymore. So what made you guys want to sort of bring Americans' attention, or audience's attention, back to the idea of our own nuclear weapons?
Want to start with the book?
Yeah.
It's I think, the greatest threat that we face in addition to global warming. And the difference between global warming and nuclear weapons is almost no attention is being paid to this arsenal that we have. And there is attention being paid to the occasional North Korean test, but the reality is, right now, we have about 7,000 nuclear weapons. Maybe 500, 600, 800 are ready to be used at a moment's notice.
We have 800 nuclear. The United States has 800 nuclear weapons that are ready to be
launched within minutes. And in my view, every one of them is an accident waiting to happen.
Where are most of them located? Where are those 500 to 800 located?
There are 440 that are in underground silos scattered throughout Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. And the rest are on submarines that are in the Atlantic and the Pacific. And one of the reasons that we don't know about these things is they're literally out of sight and out of mind. Now, I went to college in the 80s, and it was the height of the Cold War. And we thought about this all the time because it really looked like there could be a nuclear war any day. And
I mean, you see old propaganda films from the 50s, 60s about duck and cover and all these things to do. I mean, completely incorrect propaganda.
But when I was a kid in school, we used to duck under our desks to protect us from a nuclear explosion. And actually, the men who designed some of these weapons said they had fallout shelters in the early 50s. And by the late 50s, they realized they would make better wine cellars than, you know, they're not going to be safe in a fallout shelter. So they converted them to wine cellars.
So now these nuclear weapons are out of sight, out of mind. And one of the things that the documentary really focuses on are mistakes that took place in the sort of maintenance of those nuclear weapons, which needs to happen to sort of keep them usable, right? A certain type of maintenance needs to happen.
Well, the Titan II was a liquid fuel rocket, which was a very volatile, very dangerous rocket, much more so than the solid fuel rockets of today. But it had a lot of need for a lot of maintenance, and mistakes were made.
Now, the Titan II, for the audience, is what happened in Damascus, Arkansas, correct?
It's the missile, but you know, even today with the most up-to-date technology, things go wrong. I mean, Delta Airlines loses its reservation computer system for a day and everything goes haywire. Amazon goes offline every now and then for a few hours. And with nuclear weapons, the consequences are just a lot more serious potentially than not being able to buy a foam roller or something like that.
Speak for yourself, Eric.
Yeah. So, you know, this film is not, it's not an issue film like Food Inc. that we worked on together. It's a thriller. It's an attempt to make a documentary that works like a, you know, like a non-stop, minute-by-minute thriller. It begins with a worker accidentally dropping a tool in a missile silo, and over the next 10 hours, they're trying to save the missile because on top of it is the most powerful nuclear warhead the United States ever built. I mean, in this silo, there was a nuclear warhead in the middle of Nebraska that had 3 times the explosive force of all the bombs used by all the armies in the Second World War combined, including both atomic bombs. And so, you know,
3 times, I'd just like to repeat some of the things that you're putting out there,
Sorry.
Eric.
3
times more than all the bombs used in the Second World War, and this was located...
Including Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And this was located in Nebraska.
No, Arkansas.
Oh, this is Arkansas. Oh, so this was the Damascus.
Right.
That's unbelievable. Now talk to us about what happened in Damascus.
Well, you know, it's basically someone was doing routine maintenance and dropped a socket, and that socket fell and hit something and bounced and hit the rocket and created a leak in the rocket, which created a situation where the rocket eventually was going to explode. And that warhead that Eric just talked about was on top of that rocket. That dropping of the socket was called a human error, so implying that it wasn't the Air Force's fault, but there were human errors that were being made all the time with these incredibly powerful weapons. And they just kept being, you know, implying it's not really our fault, don't worry about it, it's not the system.
Well, because the Air Force essentially built an industry off of making nuclear weapons in a post-World War II era, right?
Yeah.
We had, what, 35,000 of them?
At one point, we had 30,000 nuclear weapons.
For what?
To make us safe.
To have more.
Maybe 5 for the world.
How many? Yeah, these things, if, you know, 5 of these could blow up the world, and we had 30,000 of them. And, you know, I think when you watch the film, you'll realize you won't feel that much safer knowing that, you know, we still have 7,000 of them.
How has sort of nuclear maintenance changed since the incident in Damascus, Arkansas? Has it?
The good news is that the nuclear weapons we have today are much safer than the ones that we had 30 years ago. They're not perfectly safe, but they have greater safety mechanisms. The bad news is accidents still happen. There was a serious nuclear weapons accident in a silo, a Minuteman missile silo in Colorado in May of 2014. And the details that have been released are very similar to that of the film. There were some workers doing maintenance on the missile. They did something wrong. They brought in another team to look at it, and it's unclear what happened. The Air Force is refusing to release the details of it. The Associated Press has sued under the Freedom of Information Act, but it's clear that the missile was significantly damaged. And I mean, how could there not be problems? It's impossible to think of any technology that doesn't eventually go wrong. Modern commercial airliners are as safe as they've ever been, but every now and then one of them crashes. We still don't know what happened to the Malaysian airliner. Tesla is the most beautiful automobile I've ever seen, but clearly there have been some problems with the autopilot, and you accept a certain amount of risk when you interact with technology. But the problem with nuclear weapons is if one of them goes wrong and one of them detonates, it's not a single person being killed, it's not 200 people like in an airliner, It could be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, et cetera. And this is a problem that's just been forgotten. And in some ways, the lack of awareness and the complacency on the whole issue of nuclear weapons makes the system much more dangerous. There was a saying called the Titanic effect among early software designers, and it went something like this. The safer you believe your system to be, the more dangerous it's becoming. And in many ways, that applies to this whole realm, which has just been so forgotten since the Cold War ended.
For me, one of the scariest moments in the film was when then Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, who was Secretary of Defense during the Damascus incident, said that when he had heard about this accident and heard that the weapon did not explode and there was no uranium scattered around, he forgot about it, and he went about his day, and it was of no concern because these things happen every day. And that, to me, was terrifying.
Do you think that you could view the way that we have nuclear weapons now after Damascus, where they're sort of out of sight, out of mind, as an almost microcosm for how the United States in many ways approaches war and foreign policy?
Yeah, I think on some levels, during the Vietnam War, everybody could be drafted, and it was something, there was a big anti-war movement. People were very conscious and discussing it. Now, in a way, wars are a lot more invisible. I think you're right. That's a good analogy. And when in the 80s, when I was a kid in the 60s, we were all terrified. And actually, Harold Brown said when he left his office on Friday, they were not sure if they would go back. There would be an office there on Monday. That's how tense it was. And in the 80s, there was a big anti-nuke movement, which influenced Reagan and influenced Gorbachev. So, and today, there's nothing but amnesia.
Well, the Obama apparently, last month or throughout his administration, has been trying to push a no nuclear use first agenda or a policy, and he was recently prompted by Japan and several other allies not to say that we'd like to keep North Korea in fear of us using a nuclear weapon first, which is crazy. We have maintained a Cold War across the world.
Yeah, and the problem is when you say, hey, we have the right to use these first.
But you don't.
Yeah, it gives everybody else that right as well. And there have been treaties about chemical weapons and biological weapons that have helped make the world safer. And there's a resistance to do one for nuclear weapons.
Why do you think there is such a resistance to nuclear weapons? Countries want to have a doomsday device?
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the disturbing things is they've become symbols of power. You know, we mentioned how the United States had 30,000. Well, the Soviets at one point had 40,000. So it's this absurd thing, you know, a macho thing maybe, I'm more powerful, when really, you know, the latest studies have shown that if 100 of them detonate, more than 1 billion people will be killed. So the notion of having 1,000, 30,000 is crazy. What I try to do in my book is to remind people these aren't symbols. They're not bargaining chips. They're machines. They're the deadliest, most dangerous machines ever invented. One of the things I want to point out about the film is we're talking about a lot of the bigger strategic issues and cultural issues about nuclear weapons. The heart of the film is about some young men, really young, like 19, 20, 21, whose job it was to maintain these nuclear weapons. And when this accident happened, their heroism was incredible. You know, here you had a missile on the verge of exploding with the most powerful warhead we ever built on top of it. And lots of people, lots of the military personnel evacuated the area, and there were a handful of guys who went in there and risked their lives in order to try to prevent a nuclear catastrophe. And without giving away too much of the ending, they weren't treated very well afterwards. So at the heart of this film are a lot of these issues about technology, about complex technological systems, about nuclear weapons, but it's ultimately a story of incredible bravery in the face of disaster and guys who never received the sort of recognition they deserved.
Well, because in order for them to receive the recognition, the sort of status quo of the industrial complex itself had to be called into question, and there was no way that the government was going to do that. They were just going to move the weapons out of sight, out of mind at that point, and say there's a couple bad apples that made a mistake here.
Exactly. And actually, one thing that's interesting is in researching the footage of this event and trying to think about it as a movie, there is footage from the national broadcasts and local broadcasts, and people are talking about it, but they're talking about an incident where there was never a thought or never recognition that there was a warhead that could explode. So it became a national story for a few days, but disappeared because the real threat was hidden from the American public. And it wasn't until Eric sort of uncovered this. And not only was it hidden from the American public, but it was also hidden from a numbers of people who were involved in trying to keep these weapons safe. And that's the most frightening part, that secrecy permeated everything to do with our weapon system.
And still, in many ways, does, I would imagine.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it's amazing that there was a significant nuclear weapons accident in Colorado 2 years ago.
We know nothing.
We know nothing. The Air Force, under its own rules, whenever there's an accident like this, they're supposed to publicly release the Accident Investigation Board report. They're refusing to do so. I have no idea if there was any risk of a nuclear detonation, but we're about to have proposals in Congress for new missiles, new bombers, new submarines. They're going to cost $1 trillion. And the American people have a right to know, what is this being spent on? What are the problems with the current weapons? It took me as long as 3 years to get documents from the Freedom of Information Act to write my book, Command and Control. And I was able to compare different documents that had been blacked out because they don't use the same sensor, for the same subject. So by comparing documents, I was able to see what they were censoring. And again, it wasn't information that would threaten the national security. It was information that would threaten to embarrass national security bureaucracies. So this is too important a subject to just be left to a very narrow elite in Washington whose decisions about nuclear weapons have profound consequences, not just for everyone in this room, but for people throughout the world. And we talked in the green room a little bit about the prospect of having Donald Trump as Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
One of the main sort of tools that the Clinton campaign has used against Donald Trump is saying, would you want this man at the nuclear controls? Yeah. And it's maybe worked in campaigning against him, I'm not sure.
One thing that's interesting is when a president wants to declare war, he has to go to Congress. But he doesn't have to go to anyone if he wants to fire a nuclear weapon. He can just go fire that missile because you need to respond in minutes, and you can not get congressional clearance.
It's an assumption that if you're going to fire a nuclear weapon, it's because of imminent danger.
Right, though, since we have a no first strike, that we're allowed to have a first strike policy, if someone ruffled a campaign's feathers, a president's feather, and if he had a short fuse and was someone who could get upset very quickly.
Not Donald Trump.
Right. That person could decide to fire a weapon.
The poster of calm.
Right.
Well, he's unqualified for any government position, let alone to be head of the government. And under the law, the President of the United States is the only person authorized to order the use of nuclear weapons. And he or she can order the use of nuclear weapons whenever he or she wants to. So it would take literally a mutiny in the military chain of command to countermand that sort of order. And it's extraordinary. I grew up in New York City in the 70s and 80s when Donald Trump was rising in influence. And I feel like, just to put it bluntly, he's a liar, he's a fraud, he is completely unqualified to make the sort of decisions that a president would make under pressure on whether to use weapons of mass destruction. And that alone, for me, disqualifies him from office.
Well, he's actually...
Agree.
He's actually asked, why shouldn't we be using these weapons? So.
And one more thing, and he's a racist. And I think that, quite honestly, in terms of military use of force, he would probably find it easier to use our military forces against other people of other culture because he's shown such profound disrespect.
Lack of interest in their culture, you know, like the type of person who says, oh, just wipe it off the map. We don't want to deal with them anymore, which is a racist, horrific thing to say. I mean, you mentioned that the military would have to sort of countermand a president that put forward the use of nuclear weapons. In the commander-in-chief blunder television segment that Matt Lauer did with Trump, one of the things that he said was that he doesn't trust the generals that are there right now. They've been decimated to rubble under the Obama administration. He would put in new generals, which is essentially a purge, a dictatorship purge that he's talking about. Whether he knows it or not, do you think you could potentially see a coup under a Trump presidency? I mean, it's something that we've never seen in this country, but someone who says they're going to purge the generals is exactly what establishes a coup happening in countries.
It's like out of a movie. It's unbelievable, and we do have a precedent for the military getting ready to countermand the President of the United States. In the final days of Watergate, President Richard Nixon was drinking very heavily. This is true. He was wandering around the White House at night and speaking to the portraits of other presidents. And the Secretary of Defense at the time, James Schlosser, told the Joint Chiefs of Staff that any military order that Nixon gave had to go through him, the Secretary of Defense. And that was in violation of the law, but Schlosser was prepared to prevent Nixon from ordering a nuclear strike, from ordering a war when he was in a drunken, highly emotional state. And I can't stress enough, for my book, I interviewed a lot of high-level former nuclear weapon commanders, generals, people who ran our nuclear weapons system, and I came away with enormous respect for them. During the Cold War, again, when I was in college in the 80s, we were really afraid that there might be a nuclear war any day. And what was stunning for me was to find out that these commanders were afraid too. And they took their responsibilities very, very seriously. And the notion that Donald Trump would come in and replace these people with his own hand-selected staff is terrifying. And he is he's more qualified to do brain surgery than he is to be president and commander-in-chief, because if he did brain surgery, he'd only kill the patient.
And perhaps some of the people in the room as well.
Yeah.
Let's open it up to the audience for questions. I see a man with a microphone right here. Go.
How's it going, guys?
Good.
Thank you guys for coming and talking about this. My question is, how has diving into this subject changed, if at all, your viewpoint on technology?
Well, for me, I don't feel safer knowing we have these 7,000 weapons today. And Eric just wrote about in Turkey, during the recent coup, we had a number of nuclear weapons at a base right near the Syrian border. And the electricity was cut off at that base and made it vulnerable for, Syrian, our enemies to get on that base. And frankly, I'd feel safer if those things were not there. And looking at this, you just realize that we're very good at creating complex technological, machines, but we're not, that there are mistakes that happen, and those mistakes are very low probability, but with very high consequences. And if it happens, it's very frightening. So it makes me a little uneasy, and I think that people need to at least become aware of it and help sort of the governments of the world manage them better.
I would just add very quickly that I'm not a Luddite. I love my gadgets, and I feel like I'm very computer literate. What it's made me see is we need to have a kind of a humility about our technology and we need to embrace it. But as we're embracing new technologies, we also need to be constantly questioning them. And there are certain things that I think are just beyond our capacity. I think nuclear weapons is one of them. I think nuclear power in its current configuration is beyond our capacity. So the technologies that have the potential for catastrophic effects are the ones that we probably should stay away from. And so the fewer nuclear weapons, the better, until we can get down to zero. Maybe we'll never get to zero, but whenever the numbers go down, the odds of having a terrible accident go down as well.
Well, how do you think we could get down to zero? Because it seems to me that the United States is the country with the most, or second most, as to the Soviet Russia, or to Russia. If we were to remove, say, no more nuclear weapons, then we've got North Korea that might have nuclear weapons, or another country might have nuclear weapons. And that's kind of what stops us from reducing our number for the most part, is being as much of a threat to our enemies as they could potentially be to us.
Well, we did go down from 30,000. So we're at 7,000, so we reduced by, a huge percentage. And we're certainly not less safe today. If we had 500, would we be safer? And one certainly could argue that. And ultimately, one thing Eric keeps saying is that we're better at managing these weapons than anyone else in the world. We invented this technology, and we're very good, we've been very good at it. So imagine the other possible mistakes that other countries could make. If you look at the rate of accidents in Russia, it's going to be greater, and the rate of accidents in Pakistan is going to be far greater. Again, hopefully we can figure out how to get those numbers down, and we've done it with chemical weapons and biological weapons.
Yeah, and I think that you have to keep in mind, in many ways, nuclear weapons are 20th century technology. And the fact that we can build one doesn't mean that we should have one. In 21st century warfare, there's a huge emphasis on precision weapons. There's a huge emphasis on avoiding civilian casualties. Nuclear weapons really represent the opposite. When you think about what they're good for in a military sense, they're only good for killing large numbers of civilians. And morally and ethically, that's wrong. The whole theory of nuclear deterrence, which is what exists even to this day between the United States and Russia, is that if you launch your nuclear weapons at us, we're going to launch our nuclear weapons at you. And what we're essentially doing is holding hostage the civilian population of our adversary and threatening to kill not hundreds of thousands or millions, but tens or hundreds of millions of people. Now, in the 21st century, that sort of thinking could not be more obsolete. If the United States were to get rid of all of its nuclear weapons and North Korea were to suddenly come up with 1 or 2 or 3 or something like that, militarily, we are so vastly superior to them, and our aim would be to destroy their nuclear weapon sites, not to destroy their cities and kill all of their civilians. I mean, it's just, nuclear weapons at the very heart have something fundamentally barbaric and inhuman about them. And so it's enormous progress that we've reduced the numbers significantly through the Cold War, since the end of the Cold War, but we have to continue reducing the number, prevent other countries from having them. It's absolutely amazing that no city has been destroyed by a nuclear weapon since Nagasaki in 1945, and I guarantee you, if a city, it doesn't have to be in the United States, if a city anywhere in the world is destroyed by a nuclear weapon, like an Indian accident or a Pakistani accident, there will be an anti-nuclear movement worldwide that will be unprecedented when the images of that devastation occur. So why can't we have that movement now, before something terrible happens?
I would also say that these weapons were designed to fight nation states. And ultimately, our enemies today are not nation states, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and you can't go you know, you can't wipe out Pakistan because there might be some members of Al-Qaeda there.
Well, that's what's so interesting is that you're saying that there's no protesting nuclear right now, but we are protesting drones and drone warfare, where drones are exactly what you're talking about. They're precision warfare geared towards killing the most minimal amount of civilians possible. And every now and then, I'm not trying to defend drone warfare, but every now and then civilians do end up dying, sometimes 30, 40 civilians in one particular incident. But they are clearly a reaction to the kind of warfare of World War II and of Vietnam, and a certain kind of progress.
Well, I mean, I think there's all kinds of room for legitimate debate about the current American policies for the use of drones. But you've pointed out a real absurdity, that there are organizations and there's huge amount of discussion, debate about drones, and almost no discussion and debate about our nuclear weapons. You know, literally, one weapon destroyed, the city of Hiroshima was destroyed by a nuclear weapon that could not be more rudimentary than the ones that we have right now. So,
how much stronger was the bomb, the warhead?
So the warhead involved in the Damascus accident that's at the heart of Robbie's film was 600 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And again, we can debate drone warfare, but it's these nuclear weapons that pose the greatest threat to the civilian population, not only of this country, but of Russia, of China. Every country that has nuclear weapons are threatened by having them, not to mention what's one of the unique things about nuclear weapons is their effects pay no respect to national borders. So you could go move to New Zealand, which is a nuclear-free zone, and feel as though you're safe from it, but the radioactivity circles the world. And ideally, and this may sound remarkably idealistic, but this sort of issue is something that can bring different countries together. And there is a movement that's just starting now to abolish nuclear weapons that has 80 or 90 or 100 countries have signed onto it. There are only, you know, I think there's almost 200 countries in the world, and only 9 of them have nuclear weapons. Somehow the other 190 are managing to survive without them. The first step that has to happen, though, is people need to be aware, and they need to be conscious. And I'm now 9 years into this subject. It hasn't left me feeling depressed or apocalyptic or doomed, but it's made me feel a sense of urgency that people need to think about it. And as Robbie said, in the 1980s, there was a huge protest movement. One of the biggest political demonstrations in American history occurred in Central Park against nuclear weapons. It played a major role in ending the Cold War safely. Both President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union were greatly influenced by the political demonstrations throughout the world. So it's time for people to remember that these machines are out there ready to kill them.
Next question. I hogged the stage, sorry.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. So my question for you guys is, while making the documentary and doing your research, how did you guys feel with watching all the old footage and reading all the files and things of that nature?
Well, for me, in making a film, you have to find that footage. We searched, and there was some footage from this evening of the Damascus accident, and you know, it looked quite frightening. But what was very exciting was gaining access to shoot in a Titan II missile silo, and there's one left in the world. And when we got permission, that's what enabled me to go make this movie, because I don't think we could have made it without getting in there, and wanting to make a sort of a techno thriller was the goal. But you know, seeing some of these explosions, it was unbelievable, the power of these explosions. The Secretary of Defense said he witnessed one from, I don't know, was it 50 to 100 miles away, and he could read a newspaper for a few minutes from the light. You know, I think it was 100 miles away. So this, you know, they're unimaginable. And the consequence of a low probability event, if it were to happen, everyone would say, why weren't we doing something about it before?
I had a question while I was watching the movie, kind of a silly one, I'm sorry, but when it comes that Bill Clinton is governor of Arkansas when the Damascus incident happens, I thought to myself, Bill Clinton was governor during this? Why isn't this part of the vast right-wing conspiracy against the Clintons all the time? Why doesn't this come up ever?
Well, he had ultimately nothing to do with it.
You say that. I think we have time for one more question right here.
Hi. Has the movie been screened for any government officials here or other countries, and what have the reactions been? And was there anything that you couldn't put in there?
We screened the film in Washington, D.C., and there were a number of former secretaries of defense there. And there were also members of the military today there. And the reception was very good. It's very easy to demonize the military. And in the film, there is one general in particular who we don't demonize, but make clear that he made all the wrong decisions and never accepted responsibility for it. But the reality is, in our military today, they're very concerned about a lot of these issues and concerned about how old our missiles and weapons and submarines are getting. One of the incredible things is every one of the launch control centers that is in control of one of our missiles has a mainframe computer in it. And the computers are IBM Series 1 computers that were technological marvels in 1976 when they were first introduced. And they have 8-inch floppy disks, and they are running out of spare parts. And if the President of the United States were to give an order to launch the missiles, that order would go through this computer that, you know, is like almost as high as that metal thing right there, maybe 5 foot high, huge computer, and it's got about 1,000th the memory capacity of a new iPhone. So there are real reasons to be concerned about our current nuclear technology, and I think there are people in the Department of Defense who are genuinely concerned about it. So far, the response has been good.
We also filmed at Parliament, and we filmed for...
Showed it at Parliament.
Showed at Parliament, and showed for Air Force generals. There's other screenings that had... And one thing that was very nice was that the man who dropped the socket and a number of the workers that are in the film were in the audience, and we introduced them, and Jerry Brown and the Secretaries of Defense went up and hugged the guys who had never received any recognition, and it was a very sort of a great moment. So,
guys, when can people see Command and Control? How?
Great. We open on Wednesday the 14th at the Film Forum in New York, and then there's a slow rollout across the country. We're opening in Washington a week later, and all over the United States. So hopefully people will go see the film. We meant this as a nonfiction sort of techno thriller. It's really a clock movie. It's 10 hours to save the world, and they're the heroes that Eric talked about.
It's beautifully put together. I mean, we talked mostly about the policy behind nuclear, but the film itself, before I let you go, I will say you did a wonderful job putting it together and making a sort of a thriller set inside of a documentary with the reenactments and a lot of the footage that you used.
It was great to be able to shoot in the most amazing location to go tell this story.
Thanks so much for being here, guys. Congratulations. Thank you.